What privileges and immunities? Go ahead.
The travel? Oh, yeah.
Travel is one. The privileges and immunities was interpreted as being the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. It was interpreted as being the right to use the navigable waterways. It was described as being the right to travel. And when he went in there, he's basically like, look, I got a valid unemployment claim from from South Carolina. I should be able to take this up to Connecticut. My privileges and immunities in the United States Constitution are being violated. The Supreme Court took a look at this, and I asked y'all, is this guy running a scam, or is this guy entitled to the benefits? And if you remember the mistake he made, if you're in a low cost of living state, the benefits are going to be low. If you move to a high cost of living state, the benefits are going to be high. And I think he was thinking he would still have to pay South Carolina money, but he would get Connecticut benefits. But really, he was going to get a percentage, a fraction of what he really needed. And the numbers were going to be higher, but he still wasn't really going to get enough money because the cost of living was so much higher. The Supreme Court said, yes, you qualify. And the Supreme Court said you qualify because you're being denied the right to travel, Afua. You're right. You're being denied the right to travel. And since you're being denied the right to travel, guess what? This is against your law. This is against your rights under the Constitution. And Connecticut, you have to pay. And then I gave you all the Pennsylvania story where I moved from a high benefit to a low cost of living state. And I still don't know if it was legal, but I enjoyed that time. I'll leave it at that. Does anybody, and just looking at the articles really quick, y'all remember Arizona? Y'all remember stop and frisk? And y'all remember Oklahoma, right? Look over these really, really good. The Oklahoma abortion article that was dealing with Please View the Fetus. And if you remember with Please View the Fetus, oh my goodness, there were two laws. You remember what the two laws were?
Never mind.
What's that? The doctor does not have to tell you if the child has a health condition. That's the second one. Do you remember what the first one? Go ahead, Zara. You would have to look at an ultrasound in order to what? To gain an abortion. And if you remember, we talked about this was guilt tripping versus getting some additional knowledge. Ultimately, the governor vetoed it, and the Oklahoma legislature did what? They overrode it, and it actually became Oklahoma law. Do you remember what the courts did? Courts ultimately struck this down so that it's not law anymore, but make sure that you can tell me the story on this, okay? Make sure that you can tell me the story. Stop and frisk was New York City, right?
Yeah.
There are not many articles that have numbers. The New York City stop and frisk article does. Do you remember anything about the numbers that were in that article?
87% of the crime rate dropped from when they did stop and frisk.
87% of the crime rate dropped. I think 87 is the right number.
Yeah.
But do you remember?
Oh, amount of knives they found?
87% of the amount of knives they found.
On, was it black and Hispanic people they searched? Or?
So they found 87% of the knives they found on black and Hispanic New Yorkers. Something like that.
87% of the people they stopped and frisked were black.
Yes, 87% of the people that they stopped and frisked over a 10-year period were either black or Hispanic. And the trick on this is that the population of New York is not 87% black and Hispanic. So right there, you've got some question marks. I think it's at 87% of like 4.1 million people. 4.4 million people. So basically about 400,000 people were not stopped, or I guess they were either not, 400,000 people of those 4.4 were basically not stopped and frisked at all. Or actually they were stopped and frisked, but they were not black or Hispanic. That's what I'm trying to get out. Now with this in mind, I think they gave some numbers about violent crime and shootings, right?
Yeah. Went down.
What's that?
They did not go down.
They did not go down, she says. I think there's something more specific. Jess, you look like you have it.
No, I don't. 66%
Percent?
were violent crimes from bloods, and 77% was shooting.
66% of the violent crimes in New York were committed by black New Yorkers, and 77% of the shootings were committed by black New Yorkers again. And the idea is this good law enforcement, is this discrimination, or is it both? And if you look at the numbers on this, maybe you could argue that New York City was doing the right thing. However, you're judging the proverbial book by its cover. Does anybody remember how many guns and knives and box cutters?
8,000 guns were confiscated and 80,000 knives, simply like box cutters.
8,000 guns and 80,000 knives. Yeah, in other words, I think what I was saying when I did this is every hour of every day, of every week, of every month, of every year for a decade, they were able to basically confiscate a weapon of some sort. And the trick is that as more people knew that they were taking these weapons, then in fact more, as you would imagine, would not carry them out. What was the argument that this wasn't discriminatory?
It was directly helping people in like the area where they were doing it.
What do you mean? Be a little bit more specific.
They benefited the most because people in that area did not have weapons on them.
The people most likely to be victims of these crimes were going to be black or Hispanic. So at some level, you could make an argument that this was discrimination because they're targeting people because of the color of their skin. And it seems very unusual that it would be almost 90% black and Hispanic when the population of the city is not 90% black and Hispanic for these stop and frisks. The other piece, though, is the people most likely to be victims of the crimes would have been other black and Hispanic New Yorkers. So is it good law enforcement? Is it discrimination? Is it both? Ultimately in this, what did the court say? Initially, the court struck it down. However, the court did come back because there was a lot of politics on this, and they said it was going to be okay, but they were going to have to monitor the body cameras of the police officers because they wanted to see exactly what it was that they were grasping onto as being illegal. So technically, right now it's okay, but technically it may not be. It just depends on what it is that they see. If it looks like they're discriminating, then no. And then this last one up here with Arizona, this was the Papers, Please article. Make sure that you go through that one pretty good too, because if you remember with Papers, Please, we were talking about the idea of what?
Basically, okay, so I know this. The Papers, Please, basically, it was like, and I don't remember the state specifically.
Arizona.
Arizona basically had a law basically that says that if you're an immigrant, you are not allowed to leave your house without your papers on. You must carry papers or documentation on you at all times, because if you don't, then you will be arrested.
Okay, you're getting closer. Sydney, I think I saw your hand.
I was touching. But,
Go ahead, zoom in now, Keon. Go ahead, though.
But basically, if you were asked for documentation and you couldn't provide it, you would be arrested.
When could police ask you for documentation?
If you look Mexican.
Okay, now that might be part of it, but there's
Yeah.
something more than just that.
If you did another, like, not crime, but like if you, that required police.
Somebody, I think, said it.
you were reporting.
Lawful contact. If a police officer had a lawful contact with you, then they could ask you for documentation. So if, for example, they pulled you over for a speeding violation, they could ask you for papers. If they pulled you over because you had a blown out headlight, they could ask you for papers. If you called them because you were the victim of a crime, they could ask you for papers. If, in fact, you witnessed a crime and maybe helped stop something during the investigation, they could ask you for papers. And to several of your points, kind of putting these all together, if you could not provide the documentation that said that you were legally in the country, then at that point, guess what? They can detain you and potentially remove you. Arizona's argument was, we got about 500,000 people that are undocumented. It's estimated that it's going to cost millions and tens of millions of dollars for Arizona taxpayers. And their sense was the federal government has failed and we got to do something. What was the federal government's argument? This is discrimination. And to be honest, what did Keon just say? Keon said, well, the government's going to do this if people appear to be Mexican. The idea is if Arizona is on the Mexico border, and the sense of it is that there is a number of undocumented people that are down there, it makes sense that, you know, if you were on the Canadian border, maybe you'd look for somebody different. But if you're on the Mexican border, the federal government is basically saying they're targeting people because of the way that they look. This is discrimination. This should not be allowed. Was it upheld? Yes, the Supreme Court said, you know, if you're transporting somebody, if you're working somebody, if you're housing somebody that is undocumented, they struck down all of those Arizona laws because they said there were existing federal laws. The Supreme Court said, but there's not an existing law dealing with papers, please. And other states began to attempt to duplicate what they had done in Arizona. So yeah, it is still valid law today. These are the articles. I think this covers it pretty good. I know I just have a few minutes left, and the civil rights pieces are going to be smaller, obviously, but there is some depth on this. As you look, and bear with me as I pop this up right quick, there are some terms that are on here, but just to hit on a couple of things, you notice up here, there are some amendments. There's the Missouri Compromise, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education. Don't worry about ADA, because we haven't quite gotten to that. Don't worry. Well, sexual harassment is kind of the same thing that we've been talking about, and I'll go ahead and hit on that. Remember when we were talking about political correctness, the thing that I've said over and over again is, it's not what you think is okay. It's not what a majority of people think is okay, but it's what every individual person thinks is okay. It determines whether something that you say is legal or not. So it's kind of the same thing with sexual harassment. You know, me and Zara might tell dirty jokes all the time. Me and Alexis might tell dirty jokes all the time. Me and Damien might tell dirty jokes all the time. But me and Nancy doesn't like that. So what we do with each other might be perfectly fine, but if Nancy doesn't like it, even though it's okay with everybody else, that would still be considered harassment. It's based on what the individual person thinks. And it's kind of the same thing as we were dealing with political correctness. Remember the articles. We had the words that were banned by the New York schools.
Yeah.
We had the article ultimately that was dealing with the DOA in Iowa. We had the article that dealt with, golly, what? The Christian roommate. Go ahead. The Delaware Department of Transportation. I mean, there are so many of them that are out there. Make sure that you can explain why. And not just that, but there was Tiger Woods. There was Joe Biden, there was the Seinfeld episode. All of these are really good examples of political correctness. So kind of keep that in mind. But again, the principle is, it's not what you think is okay or what a majority of people think is okay, but it's what each individual person thinks is okay. Heck, I think I had even given you the example of the tiramisu at Carrabba's with my old college roommate. Yeah. So kind of keep these things in mind. Have y'all got any questions about the terms that are up here?
Are we gonna go over dress reform on the test? 'Cause-
Dress reform, I believe, is on the take-home quiz.
Okay.
If you want it on the regular test, I'll put it on there just for you.
Wait, so, what about the invidious and
Invidious discrimination, and let me be honest, I think the 10 o'clock class didn't get this, but the 11 and the 12 did. So I'm going to go ahead and give it to the 10 right now. But the 10 o'clock class got NBA dress code, and the 11 and the 12 o'clock class didn't get that. Invidious discrimination. It is perfectly legal for the federal government to discriminate as long as they have a reason why. And what we were talking about in the other two classes is, you know, at 16, you can drive, but at 15 you can't. That's discrimination. At 18 you can vote, but at 17 you can't. That's discrimination. At 21 people can vote. Well, I'm gonna drink. Sarah can. She's got a fake. But if you don't have a fake at 20 or 19, technically that's discrimination. And the last thing that I just went over was, if you go to the amusement park, there's a sign that says if you're this tall, you can ride the roller coaster. Technically, if you're shorter than that, that's discrimination. But maybe it's physical, or maybe it's emotional, or maybe it's maturity. But there are reasons why they do this. If you say that I'm not going to hire somebody because they're blonde, or because they're a soccer player, well, that's different, because that's invidious. That's not allowed. So if it's just a judgment, or, you know, judging the book by its color, or, you know, soccer players are so lazy, you know, this kind of, that would not be allowed. That's invidious. But if there's a real reason or justification, then it's okay. What else have y'all got from this in these last few minutes? Yes, Jordan.
Can you explain the Missouri Compromise?
Missouri Compromise. What do y'all remember about Missouri Compromise?
It was basically a division of the states, right?
It was a division of the country, yes.
The free states and the
Anything
slave states.
over
Between the free states and the slave states. Do y'all remember what the line was?
36, 30, 30 led to
36 degrees, 30 minutes, north latitude. And where would the free states be? Above. And where would the slave states be? And what was the one slave state that was above? Missouri, exactly. If you remember on this, and this is where I've given you all the example of the car. Is your car yours in Maryland or Maine or Florida or Nebraska or California? And if you remember on this, when we discussed this, your car, your property is your property wherever you go. And when they were dealing with the Dred Scott case, they ended up striking down this Missouri Compromise. And basically what they said was that your slave was your slave, just like your car is your car, wherever it is that you end up going. And if you look back at Dred Scott, just to hit this really, really quick, if you remember with Dred Scott, the trick on this case was Dred Scott was promised his freedom. They wanted to organize a case so that he would be able to win his freedom in court. They wanted to lose the case so that he would win his freedom. And what did the Supreme Court say?
He's not a person.
They said Dred Scott is not a person, he is a property, and as such, he cannot sue in court just like a car or a cactus or a horse could not sue in court, these kinds of things. But then they went further, and they didn't have to, but they went further and they said your property is your property, regardless of where it is that you are, and you can't take somebody's property away just because they basically cross 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. Yes?
What do you want from sexual harassment again?
Sexual harassment, it's already in there. I'm not
Okay.
trying to be funny, but
It
we
was
just
just-
have a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just the idea that it's what the individual person thinks is harassment, not what we think when we say something or what the group
sexual
thinks.
harassment, right?
That's the sexual harassment. Yes, Kirsten.
Is there a written portion of the test, like last?
There's always a written portion.
The articles.
Okay, so like,
Yeah, there will be some essays. Yes, I promise.
What essays?
There will be, just like the last time, there will be
Oh, like
essays.
short
about like the
answers.
article?
Yes, there will be those. What's that?
About like the article.
Could be. I'll make sure I have something on there. I'll make sure I have something. On these, we talked about Civil Rights Act today, talked about Plessy today, talked about Brown today, the 15th Amendment, and just to make sure on this, when you go into this chapter, you notice there's a heck of a lot of video links. And one of the most important ones is that 15th Amendment video, 5 minutes. And we talked about what the 15th Amendment says, what it doesn't say, what the voting rights tests are. I pay good attention to that one. My intern was on the first exam. Somehow I feel like she was going to be on the second one. And if you notice in there as well, make sure that you're comfortable with those cases. We talked about Brown a decent chunk today, talked about Plessy a decent chunk today, talked about Dred Scott a decent chunk previously. Those would be possible, and of course the Dahl test. The Dahl test we talked about. So
Yeah.
all of these things could be in there. Y'all have any questions? Okay, I'm gonna try and rest up as much as I can, and I'm gonna drink some wine, and I'm gonna sit down and put together. Well, Sarah's got a faith. You can, I'm gonna sit down and write these things. I'm gonna try and have some humor, and we'll go from there. Have a good continuance of the week.